Emma stared at the heavy wooden floorboards of the town exhibition hall, trying to block out the harsh laughter. Mrs. Gable leaned close to the banker's wife, her voice a sharp, cutting whisper that carried easily across the crowded room. She remarked loudly that a woman of Emma's massive size shouldn't be wearing a faded cotton dress that clearly struggled to hold her curves. Emma tightened her grip on her small cloth purse, her knuckles turning white as her chest heaved under the weight of their judgment. She could feel the heat rushing to her cheeks, every eye in the room suddenly pinning her down like a specimen. The local blacksmith sneered, muttering a cruel joke about how Emma probably weighed more than his prize anvil. Emma took a slow, agonizing step backward, wanting nothing more than the earth to open up and swallow her whole. Then, a sudden, deafening explosion rocked the entire foundation of the building. A heavy kerosene lamp hanging from the central wooden beam shattered, raining liquid fire down onto the dry hay bales below. Thick, blinding black smoke billowed upward instantly, turning the festive county fair into a screaming trap of terror. The very people who had just been laughing turned into panicked animals, shoving and trampling each other to reach the narrow exit doors. Emma was pushed violently against the wall as the wealthy town merchants clawed their way out, completely abandoning anyone left behind. Through the roaring crackle of the rapidly spreading flames, a high-pitched, desperate scream echoed from the back storage room. It was a child's voice, muffled by the thick oak doors that had just been jammed shut by falling timber. The townspeople outside screamed for someone to save the boy, but every single man shrank back from the intense, scorching heat. Before we reveal the shocking words he whispered that changed her life forever, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a moment of this breathtaking story. Emma did not hesitate for a single second, her heart pounding against her ribs as she looked at the wall of fire. She knew that the town saw her as nothing but an oversized outcast, but that child needed a savior right now. She drew a deep breath of the scorching, ash-filled air and ran directly toward the roaring inferno. The heat blistered her skin instantly, but she pushed through the smoke, her eyes fixed on the burning storage room door. Inside, the little boy screamed for his father, his voice growing weaker by the second as the oxygen vanished. Emma planted her boots firmly into the burning floorboards and braced herself against the heat. She looked at the heavy, locked oak door and realized there was no key and no time to look for one. Using the sheer mass and strength of her full-figured body, she threw her shoulder directly against the solid wood. The door groaned under the impact, but the heavy iron bolt held fast against her first attempt. Pain shot through her shoulder, but Emma ignored it, drawing back to throw her weight against the wood once more. With a deafening crack, the thick oak frame splintered, and the door burst inward under her relentless pressure. The room was filled with choking gray smoke, making it almost impossible to see the small figure huddled in the corner. Emma spotted a large, wet wool blanket on a nearby bench and grabbed it with her bare hands. She threw herself over the trembling boy, wrapping him tightly in the damp cloth to shield him from the falling sparks. She lifted the child into her arms, his small body feeling incredibly light against her chest as the roof began to cave in. The main exit was now a solid wall of roaring orange flames, completely cutting off their path to safety. Emma looked around desperately, her lungs burning from the toxic smoke that filled every inch of the space. She saw a small, high window at the back of the room, blocked by several heavy crates of iron horseshoes. Shoving the heavy crates aside with a burst of adrenaline, she shattered the glass pane with her bare forearm. Blood smeared against the wooden frame, but she did not let go of the boy for even a split second. She carefully pushed the child through the narrow opening first, ensuring his feet touched the safe ground outside. Then, using every ounce of her remaining strength, Emma hauled her own heavy frame up and tumbled through the window. She landed heavily in the dirt outside, gasping for fresh air as the roof of the barn collapsed behind her in a shower of sparks. The townspeople gathered around the front of the building gasped as Emma crawled out of the dark smoke, holding the child. Her hands were covered in dark soot and painful blisters, and her dress was torn and singed by the flames. Suddenly, the thundering sound of galloping hooves tore through the crowded street, drawing everyone's attention. Silas Vance, the most powerful and feared rancher in the territory, threw himself off his black stallion before it even stopped. His face was pale with absolute terror as he searched the crowd for his only son, his chest heaving under his leather vest. He spotted the boy wrapped in the wet blanket and ran forward, dropping to his knees in the dirt. The boy cried out for his father, wrapping his small arms tightly around Silas's neck, as the stoic rancher held him close. Silas looked up, his intense, dark eyes locking onto Emma, who was still gasping for air on the ground. He saw her burned hands, her bleeding arm, and the way her full-figured body shook from pure exhaustion. The local doctor ran forward, but Silas pushed him aside, stepping closer to Emma with a look of profound intensity. He knelt beside her in the dust, ignoring the whispers of the wealthy townspeople who still watched from a safe distance. Silas reached out, his large, calloused hand gently cradling Emma's burned wrist with a tenderness no one knew he possessed. He leaned close to her ear, his deep, rumbling voice cutting through the noise of the crackling fire. He whispered that she had saved his entire world today, and that the town would never look down on her again. The heavy silence of the plains seemed to settle over the smoking ruins of the barn as Silas helped Emma to her feet. Every eye in the town square watched them, their previous mockery turning into a tense, uneasy quiet. Emma tried to pull her torn sleeve down to hide her scarred skin, but the fabric was completely ruined by the fire. She looked down at her dusty boots, waiting for the familiar whispers and mocking chuckles to start up again. Instead, Silas kept his firm, steady hand on her arm, guiding her toward his heavy, leather-trimmed wagon. Mrs. Gable stepped forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she offered to take the child into her own clean carriage. Silas didn't even look at the woman, his jaw tightening into a hard, unyielding line as he walked right past her. He lifted Emma into the front seat of his wagon with a gentle strength that left her completely breathless. Emma sat rigid on the leather bench, acutely aware of how her full figure pressed against the narrow seat. She expected Silas to say something about her size, or perhaps complain about how the wagon tilted under her weight. But the stoic rancher simply climbed up beside her, took the reins in his large hands, and snapped them over the horses. The wagon rolled away from the town, leaving the staring crowd and the charred remains of the exhibition hall behind. As they crossed the open prairie, the cool wind bit into Emma's burns, making her flinch involuntarily. Without a word, Silas reached behind his seat and pulled out his heavy, wool-lined duster jacket. He draped it over her shoulders, the thick material smelling deeply of cedar, rich leather, and tobacco. Emma pulled the massive jacket tight around herself, feeling completely swallowed by his warmth and his presence. They drove in silence for over an hour, the only sound being the rhythmic thud of the horses' hooves on the dirt road. Finally, the grand wooden archway of the Vance Ranch came into view, stretching across the horizon like a fortress. The main house was a massive structure of polished stone and heavy timber, surrounded by endless green pastures. Silas brought the horses to a gentle stop in front of the wide front porch and immediately hopped down. He didn't wait for his ranch hands to assist, stepping up to Emma's side of the wagon and reaching up for her. Emma hesitated, whispering that she was too heavy for him to carry down from such a high seat. A ghost of a smile touched Silas's rugged face as he gripped her waist firmly, lifting her down as if she weighed nothing at all. He guided her into the warmth of the house, leading her straight to a large plush armchair by the stone fireplace. His young son, who had been riding quietly in the back, ran to the kitchen and returned with a basin of clean water. Silas knelt in front of Emma on the hardwood floor, dipping a clean white cloth into the cool water. He began to wash the black soot from her arms with meticulous care, his touch incredibly light against her raw skin. Emma winced as the cloth touched a particularly deep burn on her wrist, her fingers twitching with pain. Silas stopped instantly, blowing softly on the skin to cool the sting before applying a thick, soothing salve. He worked in absolute silence, his dark eyes focused entirely on healing the woman who had saved his family. When he finally finished wrapping her arms in clean white linen, he stayed on one knee, looking up into her face. The firelight flickered across his sharp cheekbones and the silver hairs at his temples, making him look incredibly formidable. He asked her in a low, gravelly voice why a woman treated so terribly by the town would risk her life for his boy. Emma swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she confessed that a child's life mattered far more than her own broken pride. She added that she knew what it felt like to be trapped and helpless while everyone else just stood by and watched. Silas stared at her for a long moment, his chest rising and falling heavily beneath his dark western shirt. He stood up, looking down at her full figure with a deep, fierce intensity that made her heart race in her chest. He told her that from this day forward, no one under the western sky would ever make her feel helpless again. Silas stood up from the floor, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished wood of the living room. He called for his head housekeeper, a kind, elderly woman named Martha, and instructed her to prepare the finest guest suite in the eastern wing. Emma tried to protest, stating that she could not possibly stay in such a grand place while her own small cabin sat empty. Silas cut her off with a single, firm shake of his head, his deep voice leaving absolutely no room for argument. He told her that her cabin was miles away, and he would not allow a woman with such severe injuries to fend for herself. Martha smiled warmly at Emma, gently taking her by the elbow and leading her up the wide oak staircase. The guest suite was larger than Emma's entire home, complete with a massive canopy bed and a roaring fireplace of its own. For the next 2 days, Emma remained in the quiet sanctuary of the ranch, her burns healing under the care of Martha's soothing ointments. She spent long hours looking out the large glass windows, watching the ranch hands herd thousands of cattle across the endless hills. On the third morning, Silas walked into the dining room where Emma was quietly sipping a cup of black coffee. He sat across from her, his expressions unreadable as he placed a heavy leather pouch onto the wooden table between them. The pouch hit the surface with a loud metallic clink, spilling several bright, heavy gold coins onto the table. Silas informed her that he had ridden into town at sunrise to visit the local merchants and the land office. He explained that he had paid off every single cent of the debt her late father had left behind on her small property. Emma gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears instantly welled up in her eyes at the sheer magnitude of his gesture. She whispered that she could never possibly repay him for such wealth. But Silas merely shrugged his broad shoulders. He told her that the gold was nothing compared to the life of his son, which she had delivered back into his arms. He then added that he had also paid a very personal visit to the town blacksmith and the local dry goods merchant. Silas's eyes darkened into a dangerous, icy black as he recounted how he had stood in the center of the town square. He had warned every man present that if he ever heard another cruel word whispered about Emma's appearance, he would ruin them. He promised the townspeople that he would pull his massive funds from the local bank and ensure their businesses withered to dust. Emma listened in utter disbelief, her heart pounding with a strange, overwhelming mixture of gratitude and profound awe. No one had ever stood up for her like this, let alone the most powerful and respected man in the entire territory. Silas stood up from the table, telling her to finish her breakfast, because a carriage from the city would be arriving shortly. An hour later, a grand, covered coach pulled up to the front porch, carrying the city's most exclusive and expensive seamstress. Silas had commissioned the woman to bring bolts of the finest fabrics available, from deep emerald silks to rich, heavy velvets. The seamstress looked at Emma's full, voluptuous figure with a professional eye, immediately pulling out her measuring tapes. Unlike the cruel women in the town, this woman smiled, remarking that Emma's deep curves were absolutely perfect for the finest European cuts. Silas stood by the doorway, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched the colorful fabrics being draped over Emma's shoulders. He pointed to a luxurious crimson silk and a deep navy velvet, commanding the seamstress to make dresses that highlighted her shape. He explicitly stated that he did not want her curves hidden beneath loose, baggy drapes like the townspeople forced her to wear. When the first custom gown was fitted a few days later, Emma stood in front of the full-length mirror in her bedroom. The rich emerald fabric hugged her full hips perfectly, cinching comfortably at her waist and accentuating her lush, full bosom. For the first time in her entire life, Emma did not see an oversized outcast looking back at her from the glass. She saw a stunning, breathtaking woman whose full figure possessed a regal dignity that no thin town gossip could ever match. As she stepped down the stairs, Silas paused at the bottom, his intense gaze locking onto her with an undeniable heat. His eyes traveled slowly over her full curves, a look of pure reverence and deep, unmistakable desire flushing across his rugged face. He stepped forward, taking her soft hand in his and kissing the back of it with a slow, deliberate passion. He whispered that she looked more beautiful than the sunrise over the prairie, and that she belonged right here by his side. The peace of the Grand Ranch was shattered on a warm Thursday afternoon when a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Silas was out in the northern pastures checking on a newborn calf, leaving Emma alone on the wide front porch. 3 fancy carriages rolled up the gravel driveway, stopping right in front of the main house with a dramatic flourish. Mrs. Gable stepped out first, adjusting her expensive lace parasol, while her eyes scanned the beautiful estate with bitter envy. Behind her followed the town banker and the wealthy dry goods merchant, their faces twisted into masks of false righteousness. They marched up the wooden steps, confronting Emma as she stood tall in her stunning new emerald silk dress. Mrs. Gable sneered openly, pointing a gloved finger at Emma's full figure and calling her a shameless, scheming thief. She loudly accused Emma of deliberately setting the exhibition barn on fire just to play the hero and trap the rich rancher. The banker stepped forward, waving a legal document in the air and claiming they had proof of her fraudulent behavior. He shouted that a woman of her low status and oversized breeding didn't belong in a palace like the Vance estate. Emma felt a cold hand squeeze her heart, the old familiar feelings of humiliation trying to claw their way back to the surface. She took a deep breath, looking down at the cruel townspeople from the top of the porch with an unyielding dignity. She replied in a calm, steady voice that they knew absolutely nothing about honor, sacrifice, or the truth of that terrible day. Mrs. Gable laughed mockingly, stepping closer and threatening to have the sheriff drag Emma to the county jail in heavy irons. Suddenly, the sharp, unmistakable sound of a Winchester rifle being cocked echoed loudly from the side of the house. The townspeople froze in their tracks, their faces instantly draining of all color, as Silas stepped out from the shadows. His dark western hat was tilted low over his eyes, and his jaw was set in a terrifying, rigid line of pure fury. He walked slowly across the porch, the heavy iron barrel of his rifle pointed directly at the trembling banker's chest. Silas demanded to know who gave them permission to step foot onto his land and insult the woman who saved his family. The banker stammered out an excuse, his hands shaking so violently that he dropped the legal paper onto the dusty floorboards. Silas didn't say another word. He simply raised the rifle and fired a deafening shot directly between the banker's leather boots. The loud blast echoed across the open prairie, causing the carriage horses to rear up in absolute panic and terror. The wealthy town merchants screamed, scrambling backward down the porch steps as Silas racked another heavy bullet into the chamber. He pointed the smoking barrel right at Mrs. Gable's face, his deep voice dropping to a low, deadly, and terrifying growl. He told her that if she or any of her pathetic friends ever spoke Emma's name again, he would personally bury them in the dirt. He ordered them to get off his land immediately before he stopped using warning shots and started aiming for their hearts.
The townspeople did not hesitate, throwing themselves back into their carriages and whipping the horses into a frantic gallop. As the carriages sped away in a cloud of thick dust, Silas turned his attention back to Emma, lowering his rifle completely. He walked over to her, his intense dark eyes filled with an overwhelming tenderness as he looked at her beautiful, trembling face. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently cupping her soft cheeks, erasing every trace of the town's cruelty with his touch. He told her that no one would ever question her place by his side again, because she was about to become the law of this land. The grand town hall was packed to the brim with every citizen from the territory, the air thick with tense anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire through the valleys that Silas Vance had called a mandatory meeting for every merchant, rancher, and laborer. Mrs. Gable sat in the front row, her hands nervously clutching her lace handkerchief as she avoided looking at the empty stage. The heavy double doors at the back of the hall swung open with a loud thud, and a sudden, breathless silence fell over the crowd. Silas walked in first, dressed in his finest black broadcloth suit, his chest broad and his posture radiating absolute authority. On his arm walked Emma, looking absolutely radiant in a custom-tailored dress of deep crimson velvet that proudly embraced her full figure. The rich fabric hugged her voluptuous curves beautifully, making her stand out like a queen among the pale, plain women of the town. She held her head high, her eyes calm and confident as she walked down the central aisle, completely ignoring the stunned gasps around her. Silas led her up onto the wooden stage, turning to face the entire assembly with a cold, unyielding gaze that forced everyone to look down. He unbuttoned his jacket, revealing a velvet-lined wooden box that he placed carefully onto the speaker's podium. He opened the box to reveal a massive, flawless ruby ring that glowed like a burning coal under the oil lamps of the hall. Silas looked directly at the crowd, his deep, gravelly voice echoing off the high rafters with undeniable power. He announced to the entire territory that Emma was no longer an outcast, but the future Mrs. Silas Vance. He took her soft hand in his and slid the heavy ruby ring onto her finger, sealing his promise in front of God and every witness present. He declared that she was now the true owner of his empire, the mistress of his lands, and the undisputed queen of the prairie. The townspeople sat in stunned, absolute silence, realizing that the woman they had once mocked now held their entire survival in her hands. Silas looked down at Emma, his rugged face softening into a brilliant, devoted smile as he kissed her deeply right there on the stage. Emma felt a wave of pure triumph wash over her, knowing that her full figure and her brave heart had finally found their perfect home. What do you think of Emma's incredible journey from a mocked outcast to the most powerful woman on the frontier? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and let us know if Silas handled those cruel town gossips the right way.